Welcome once again to the First Unitarian Church of Honolulu's Tuesday night Pau Hana. This is the time when we gather together to discuss and learn more about our own community, the community that we are in, and the wider world in various ways. Sometimes we listen to music, and today is as wonderful as always. I'm very excited to introduce Nicole Woo, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at Appleseed Hawai'i. And so welcome, Nicole. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
So a few little notes. If, again, everyone's in charge of their own microphones. If you're going to have side conversations, maybe mute. If not, I'll do it for you gently and lovingly. Also, if you have questions, you know, however you want to do it. If it's something you want, Nicole hasn't made any specific requests that we not have questions in the chat. It's a little easier if you just private message me the questions. It's easier for me to kind of manage the subject and where I'm going, but it's really up to you. But please don't, unless we open it up for questions, please don't ask questions out loud, and we'll take it from there. So, Nicole, I've mentioned you in past Pau Hanas with Kevin Landers when we were talking about many of the things that he does around the island. Also with Nate Hicks, I also mentioned your incredible work, and it's work that I rely on. And so, rather than me talk about what I think of your work, would you mind telling us what it is you do at Hawaii Appleseed and what Hawaii Appleseed is?
Yeah, so Hawaii Appleseed is part of a network of Appleseed centers around the country that focus, they started kind of as legal services, but they've branched out into all different sorts of ways to assist low-income people. I think there's 17 Appleseeds in different states across the country. And we're all very independent. We all work on different issues based on what's happening in our communities. So Hawaii Appleseed's mission is just to sort of help and advocate on behalf of low-income families in our state. And that's really broad. So we've got some folks working on housing and homelessness. We have some people looking at the state budget and the city and county budget. We actually have some attorneys who occasionally sue people or sue the government more often on behalf of low-income folks when they're doing stuff that is not helpful. I'm a policy analyst, so that means that I do a lot of research, and I write reports and blog posts, and I provide data for other people. And I also go to the state legislature, sometimes to the city council, and try to nudge them to do the right thing on behalf of low-income folks in our state. And I specialize in hunger issues and wages and taxes. So sort of like, you know, money in, money out, and making sure people have enough to eat are my key areas of interest. And my history goes back pretty far. So I bring experience from doing the same kind of work in different parts of the country and even different parts of the world. So it's kind of fun to apply what I've learned here in Hawaii. And you know, try to help out here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you, Nicole. It's interesting that you bring up the hunger piece. I read or saw a special that we were on track as a nation to end childhood hunger pretty well through Carter and until I think it was Reagan that at some, and maybe it was, could you say something about the history of, I understand that the childhood hunger and hunger in general is something we don't always talk about as a policy issue. It's more of like a, oh my God, this is happening question. But can you say something about the history of hunger in this country?
Yeah, I actually spent quite a few years specializing in childhood hunger. So you asked the right person.
Yeah.
It actually, I can go back to my childhood because I wasn't hungry, but my mom ran a daycare center in a housing project in the Bronx. And I remember during the Reagan years that she was at home and she was crying because she said to me she didn't know how she was going to feed her children. And I remember that, you know, I was a kid, so I didn't know what she really was talking about. And then later on in my career, I started to work for a national anti-hunger organization started working on the exact programs that provide food for daycare centers, especially low-income daycare centers, and it kind of came full circle that I finally understood like why my mom was crying. But yeah, you might remember ketchup as a vegetable.
Yep.
A lot more than just making ketchup into a vegetable. And it actually never became a vegetable because it was my prior organization and my old boss and her husband, you know, among others, who called the media about ketchup being a vegetable. So they managed to knock that away, but that whole set of policies from Reagan basically just made it a lot harder for people to get assistance. They cut the budget of a lot of these programs. So as I said, my mom all of a sudden was facing these huge budget cuts in the food program that she relied on to provide food to the low-income kids in her daycare center. And I also remember growing up in New York City when homelessness kind of started. And, you know, that also goes back to the 80s when a bunch of folks were let out of state mental institutions, is how I understood it when I was learning about this in New York, working at the Coalition Against Hunger, that a lot of folks who were, you know, maybe these institutions were not the best places, but it did care for people. They did care for people, and a lot of folks were just let out onto the streets. And there was a surge in homelessness. And I think sometimes people forget that, you know, it's a relatively recent phenomenon of having folks being hungry, having folks going to food banks and food pantries. There's a federal program called the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and that's what provides food to the food banks all across the country. Feeding America, food banks, the Hawaii Food Bank, you know, the basket on the Big Island. That program originally was called Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, TEFAP, T-E-F-A-P. And then when I was working on this, maybe about 15 years ago, during the Bush years, they just changed the T from temporary to the. And it was sort of a recognition that this was not temporary, that food banks and food pantries and soup kitchens were a permanent fixture. And that's, you know, again, I think sometimes folks forget that this was not normal, you know, 40 years ago. You know, people did not have to go to a food bank every month to make ends meet, which is, you know, what we see here in Hawaii. So, you know, it is an issue here in Hawaii, especially now during the pandemic. I don't know if you read, but the food bank gave out something like 8 times as much food in 2020 as they did in all of 2019. It's just not sustainable. So a lot of the work that I do is focusing on the federal and state and county safety nets, because we know that charities can't do everything. The problem is way too big. You know, one thing that I learned at the Coalition Against Hunger in New York, which was a network of over 1,000 soup kitchens and food pantries, most in communities of faith, that you can't just rely on, you know, honestly, mostly elderly church ladies to support all these folks who just aren't making enough money, right? They're not getting the kind of support and the benefits that they used to get. And we just kind of dump all of this on the charitable sector, people with good hearts, and it's just too much for them. And we're finding that right now. You know, Ron Mizutani at the food bank has just recently been saying that it's not sustainable. The Hawaii Food Bank can't keep going at the pace it's going. You know, something needs to give. Federal government, for example, needs to get some more money over to the states. But we're at a breaking point. You know, people are not donating food in the way that they used to the food bank because they're hurting themselves. So it's an issue. During this pandemic at Hawaii Appleseed, we focused on a lot of these programs for keiki especially. So we were working with community groups to get free meals to kids as a complement to the Department of Education sites using federal funds, trying to get these programs to work better. There was also a new federal benefit called Pandemic EBT that went out to families with school-aged kids who are food insecure. So that was some of what Hawaii Appleseed was doing just to try to get food out to people. But there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, when you bring up the childhood hunger, it reminds me that a friend who had adopted two children during seminary explained that one of them was still hoarding food, you know, and what, like she'd like eat half her meal and squirrel away this. She found a cheeseburger that was pretty old, like in the bottom of her bag that she'd forgotten about. And she just said to me offhandedly, she's like, it only takes one experience with food insecurity to lead to a lifetime of effects, or at least an early childhood development effects. Do you look policy-wise at how this affects people, this problem? I don't mean to just focus on childhood hunger, but it is something you dealt with, so I did want to ask about your experiences with the long-term impact of that.
Oh yeah, there's so much research that has come in over the years showing that just one bout with poverty and hunger for children has long-term effects. You know, they look at earnings and learning, academic achievement, and earnings as adults, and yeah, it's rough. You know, I have to say, you know, during this pandemic, we have to be very careful about controlling the virus, but at the same time, there are some real effects of this unemployment crisis, and if evictions start happening, those are the kind of traumas that affect children for the rest of their lives. So, you know, another thing that Hawaii Appleseed has been doing is trying to encourage the governor and the state legislature to get the federal CARES Act money, you know, to the people who need it. They just keep saying that they're still deciding, you know, they're still trying to figure out what to do with all this money. And, you know, folks like us are saying families are hurting right now. They need the money right now. You need to move a little faster. So it's actually been a few months for Hawaii Appleseed.
Yeah, I mean, it raises that question that you brought up that's so important, which is that that charity, quote charity, you know, food banks, things like that, was never what was meant to sustain a society. Capital or funds or money is what people need. And can you tell me about what you're facing between that policy argument that says funding these services, and maybe I'm wrong, but the balance between funding services for people and like food banks, things like that, and funding the people, like making sure they have what they need. Can you talk us, is there a debate going on about that, or is that something you're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, I worked in hunger for years. I worked at the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. Then I went to the Food Research and Action Center in DC, which was the national anti-hunger group. And I would say maybe about 15 years ago, I kept saying to my boss, you know, we got to start working on things like the minimum wage, like, you know, make it so people can afford to buy food and we're not having to rely as much on the federal programs and charities. And at the time, 15 years ago, my boss said, no, we're going to stay in our lane. We're just going to work on hunger. And that's actually part of why I moved to a new job. I spent 10 years at an economic policy think tank in DC called the Center for Economic and Policy Research, where we focused on things like wages and, you know, paid sick days and other things to just kind of deal with kind of basic economic security. And it was part of my thinking was, you know, I've been in hunger, anti-hunger for a while now, and I feel like the root causes are just making sure people can buy stuff, they can afford their rent. So I did 10 years of that. So coming here to Hawaii, I've been working on trying to raise the minimum wage for the last 4 years, and it's just been so disappointing. Our minimum wage is $10.10 an hour. It's $21,000 a year full time. You know, we're the most expensive state in the nation. Honolulu is the fourth most expensive metro area in the nation. I just put a blog post up yesterday at Hawaii Appleseed looking at the 15 most expensive states. This is according to the US Government Bureau of Economic Analysis. They look at cost of living. Looking at the other 14 cities, the lowest minimum wage in that group is $12 an hour, and we're at 10. And a bunch of them, about 5 of them are already at $15 an hour and going higher. And I've done this for, the states. If you look at our average wage here in Hawaii and then adjust it we're about in the middle, but if you adjust it for cost of living, we have the lowest average wage in the nation. So there's so many numbers and data out there. Just, look at the fact that we have homelessness, some of the highest rates in the country. We have the most overcrowded housing in the nation. There's so much evidence to show that people need to get paid more. And yet we have not been able to get the minimum wage increased. The last time it went up was January 1st, 2018, and there are no automatic increases. The governor and the state legislature have to do something for those folks to get a raise. And, basically it's been the business community. They come to the hearings, they tell the legislators that raising the minimum wage is going to destroy business in Hawaii. And we've looked back at the last time the minimum wage went up here in Hawaii and businesses did fine. We have charts about that. But it really does seem like the business community was able to just stop it. We got really close a few times. So that's a big one. And we also look at things like paid family leave, paid sick days, some of these other sort of supports that families need to make ends meet. So as I said, Hawaii Appleseed looks at a lot of stuff.
So I have a conversation with my father sometimes about economic policy, and and one of the well, I've had a lot of therapy, so no, I'm just kidding. And so we sometimes discuss the universal basic income,
Mm-hmm.
and he recently read an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal, about a small community in the South that did it for about 1,000 people. It might have just been 100 families, and were shocked to discover how well everyone did on universal basic income. They did not fritter away the money on whatever racist thing. Sorry, it's usually a racist thing that people think it's going to be frittered away on. That credit card debt went down. Medical care went up because people could figure out when they could make appointments and weren't waiting on lines and things like that. So have you looked at all at the universal basic income or something like that?
Yeah, Representative Chris Lee there was a bill a few years ago that passed that was very, a symbolic bill, basically saying we're going to start a study group on UBI. It's not happened. And it was actually on my list of things to do right before the pandemic hit, was to get in touch with him and see if we could nudge that along. At the think tank in DC, it came up. Universal basic income basically is, let's give people enough money so that they don't have to work, and just give everybody like basic economic security. So it's like, Andrew Yang was saying $1,000 a month. And it ranges, but that idea has actually been around for decades, if not maybe a century or more. And they have tried it in different parts of the world. I think there have been a few, like you said, communities here in the United States that have tried it. Canada has tried it in small local areas. And yeah, as you said, like people don't waste it. They still actually do go to work.
Yeah.
And so it's good. One thing that I've noticed when I look at the numbers, though, is that a lot of people like Andrew Yang, they say, oh, we're going to save all this money because we're going to get rid of welfare and food stamps and all of the other supports and just give everybody UBI. And if you do that, like it kind of works out like with the numbers, because you can imagine this kind of money to everybody it's a lot of money. The thing that they sort of forget is that no matter what, even if we give everybody income, some people are always going to need a little extra help. Like we're still going to have some government programs that support people who are still falling through the cracks, even with UBI. So I do think like the numbers don't always pan out the way that they say it does, because a lot of these guys, like Silicon Valley guys, love UBI these days. They don't have a lot of experience with how government programs work and how the lives of low-income folks really are. And so, I like the idea of UBI, but I don't think it's the like panacea that a lot of folks say it will be. I think it could help, but it'll be really expensive and not sure exactly where we're going to get that money unless we tax rich people, which would be, but it's, you know, it's going to cost more than they say it does, is basically my bottom line, just because the way that they simplify the system is not really realistic.
Now,
but it's
what
to think about.
we've done some policy, you know, chit chat and stuff, which I like, but and we can get more into some of that stuff. But one of my questions I always have for folks is, why this? Why this work for you? And what was it? Was it the experience with your mother? Was it, you know, that did you fall into it? Did you have passion for this? And what's a little of your background that got you? What were the steps you took to get you here?
Yeah, I mean, I like to blame my parents.
Good.
My parents are immigrants from China and Hong Kong. You know, they went through World War II as children. So they, you know, they're super frugal, kind of like Depression era parents here in the States, like can't throw anything away, you know, just didn't, I mean, my dad's doing great in retirement because he never spent any money while he was working. So, but he taught in public schools in New York, and he did special ed, and most of his students were Black and brown and low income. And then my mom ran a daycare. She was a social worker, and she ran a daycare center in the Bronx in a low income housing project. It's very unusual for immigrant Chinese parents to have those kind of jobs. When my dad got to the States, he was actually a child, and he was extremely poor. He and his siblings were hungry. So growing up, you know, definitely when homelessness started happening in New York City, he couldn't pass a homeless guy without giving them something. So it definitely comes from my parents. And so, you know, at first I just wanted to help people. You know, I volunteered at soup kitchens and, you know, homeless shelters. And then I worked at the New York City Coalition Against Hunger, which is food pantries and soup kitchens. And I was doing that when President Clinton's welfare reform came through back in the 90s. And that was actually a really cruel and harsh law. I don't think people remember that, but it was, I mean, even if you had a green card, you could not get college loans under that law. You couldn't get food stamps if you had a green card. It was, you know, and you know, people with green cards are those that, you know, came in the right way. They waited for their space in line. You know, I hate to make it like deserving versus undeserving, but the fact that they were even like taking benefits away from green card holders was just shocking. And so we saw the need at the soup kitchens and food pantries in New York just skyrocket because they were throwing so many people off of food stamps and welfare. And I just thought, you know, we're trying to bail out this ship, and yet there's like these missiles coming from DC, like poking more holes in the bottom. Like I got to go to DC and like try to stop it. Like I thought I could. So I went to DC more towards the beginning of the Bush years and spent a few years playing defense on hunger issues. You know, and it actually was in New York. You know, in New York, we started advocating for a state level food stamp program to fill in the holes in the food stamp program because the federal government like made it so many people couldn't get it. So, you know, there was a bunch of advocates saying we got to get New York State to put money in so that all these folks can still get food stamps. So that's when I started learning about policy and how important it is and how you can make really, it's like incremental progress, but it's like really wide ranging effects, which is different from direct service where you might, you know, on a case-by-case basis get a lot of satisfaction. It's just a very different way of operating. But I just kind of moved to policy, kind of realizing these soup kitchens and food pantries just can't do it all, right? We need to get better policies in place. So, and as I said, from the hunger, I moved on to the wages, and then the job opened at Hawaii Appleseed, and I felt like I had been kind of away from normal people living in DC. Like I was just on phone calls with folks in the States, but not really on the local level. So I was really interested in coming to Hawaii and like trying to apply what I learned and get back to the local level, more direct access to learning about the benefits and how it affects people.
Yeah. And how long have you been here in Hawaii?
About 4.5 years now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you tell us something about, like, when I hear policy, it sounds good to me. It's got, you know, a little bit of people, you know, political. To me, it sounds like kind of a balance between argument and education, like going back and forth between educating legislators and advocating, education and advocation. Can you say something about what, I mean, I hear the word and in my brain I know what it means, but can you say something about what policy interesting you meant?
I mean, policies, you know, it's laws and regulations and, you know, big systemic change in my mind. And so working on policy is trying to figure out ways to improve it and change it. But you're right, it takes all different levels of advocacy. You know, there's lobbying up on Capitol Hill, but there's also people on the ground, you know, pressuring their lawmakers, you know, as constituents, you know, as citizens. So that's, you know, that's some of the fun part is working with good people on changing policy. But, you know, a lot of my work has been research, kind of boring, ins and outs of these laws and regulations. But I mean, that's what I learned after welfare reform in New York, right? It was like trying to figure out what this welfare reform was going to do to people in New York, and then try to explain it to the, you know, mostly elderly church ladies who are running these food pantries and trying to figure out how to get that word to their customers and clients. So it was working with immigrant groups, coming up with flyers that made things more simple, getting it translated into different languages, and then working with all of these groups to lobby up in Albany, New York, to get the state level food stamp program running. And so, you know, it's that kind of, you need all different types of people. You need some kind of nerdy people to like study the laws and the regulations, but then you need a whole bunch of other people to help push it through in all different ways.
So do you partner with community organizations to try to do that? I mean, you've got a lot on your plate. You're doing analysis, you're getting this data together, you're doing this. How are you connecting with the people you need to do the lobbying? You're not, I know you're doing some of the lobbying, but I know how a policy analyst, economist, you know, is going to feel talking to a, you know, well, you're not a constituent, blah, blah, you know, but how are you liaising or making relationships with constituents most effectively, do you think?
Yeah, and that's one thing that Hawaii Appleseed is getting better and better at. We're learning. But yeah, Faith Action is one of the groups that we work with, especially on minimum wage and some affordable housing issues. And that's wonderful. We need more groups like Faith Action. And yeah, there's the kind of like organized groups don't exist here in Hawaii in the way that I'm used to in other states. So it's been kind of fun trying to figure it out. One thing that, you know, I actually know Pastor TJ and I know Nancy Young from working on immigration issues through my church, Harris United Methodist. And just through that volunteer work, Hawaii Appleseed has started convening an immigration task force just since the pandemic hit, just because immigrants are being left out of the conversation here in Hawaii in terms of who's hurting. You know, we're seeing it now with COVID, right? They don't have, a lot of the community groups in the immigrant community I'm finding here in Hawaii are just putting out fires. And they're not thinking we need to try to change the rules that are hurting us. So Hawaii Appleseed has just started trying to put together, you know, pulling together various groups just to start working on immigrant issues. And it is, you know, it was kind of surprising to come here and just find out that there was nothing here in terms of immigrant advocacy.
Preach.
There were some past I've heard of, like there was like a DACA Dreamers group, but it kind of fell apart. You know, there was an immigration coalition that I think Stan Bain was leading, again, before I came here. So I was trying to find out who to hook up with on immigration issues, and it sort of became clear that it needs to be built here in Hawaii. So, but we work with Local 5. They're in the amazing union. We need more Local 5s. And yeah, we are trying to build more coalitions of advocacy groups and regular citizens to advocate and lobby.
Because the direction you're sending your work is very powerful. Like Nate Hicks's was with us a few weeks ago, and what you've provided Living Wage Hawaii with data, even in a small way, and just the data points he has available off the top of his head and with his friends, which he said, I got all from Nicole, it's, so in a way you're going that you're helping folks build in some areas, but then and then, it sounds like now reaching out, in a more, in another way, kind of bringing people together, maybe less with data and more with relationships. Is that kind of right?
Absolutely. I think, I came to Hawaii with my experience in other parts of the country. When I was in DC, I worked with a lot of state groups and learned about coalitions that worked in other places. And in New York City, definitely built a lot of coalitions. So it's definitely been something that, I've been working on hard in Hawaii because, I was saying to my bosses when I first came here, like, we don't have grassroots, we don't have members, it's like a small office. Like, we have to partner with other groups. We're not going to get anything done. So it has been a growth area for Hawaii Appleseed. Yeah, we've also put together a hunger action network to work on hunger issues. Got some funding for it. But yeah, that came out of some lobbying we were doing around SNAP about, it's this law that we actually did get passed, although the money in it is like a tiny fraction of what we asked for, but it's a program called SNAP Double Up, which allows people who get SNAP to get like double credit if they use their SNAP dollars to buy Hawaii grown fresh fruits and vegetables. And it's something that exists in other states. So to get that passed, we had to work with all these different groups that are interested in food access, and the farmers markets and the farmers and the supermarkets, and the American Heart Association is really interested in it. So that's been a really great coalition to work with. So we got some funding to like formalize it. So one of my colleagues runs our hunger network as her job. So yeah, it's definitely something we're trying to build here. It's needed.
Now, you also, and I just want to move a little into this, you mentioned a few times the church community. You say, your words, church ladies, and reaching out to them and doing that kind of network. You are involved in a faith community. Where do you see, in an ideal world, faith communities fitting into the kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I think faith communities have a really powerful voice. I've seen it work in other places, and I've heard about Faith Action the last time the minimum wage passed, which was probably 2014. I'm thinking something like that. It's been a while since we passed a minimum wage law, and so I definitely asked people, like, how did it pass? What happened? And one factor was that Clayton Key, a legislator, just took it on as his issue, and he just really put all of his effort and his energy and all of his political chips, he spent them all on minimum wage. But also, apparently, Faith Action was able to get lots of people into the Capitol and really apply political pressure onto our legislators. So it is a combination. And I've seen it in other parts of the country. There's a moral voice that communities of faith can bring to the discussion. That's very important. Here in Hawaii, like, we do have quite a few legislators who are, Catholic, for example. Or, we actually, through Faith Action, we try to figure out where some of these legislators go to church, and then we try to figure out if we know anybody at those churches to talk to them. That's organizing. And then there's also the charitable side. A lot of faith communities have on the ground experience working with people who are hurting, who need help, and they can speak to that as well. So like Father Dearlock at St. Elizabeth's, is it St. Elizabeth's? You know, his church has a lot of programs that serve low-income people, and so he's been able to speak to that quite powerfully over the past few years, trying to get the minimum wage increased. So we can definitely use more of that. And you know, Faith Action worked on the REITs bill, the real estate income tax, real estate investment trust tax bill, and that was amazing. I started working on that years before Faith Action came. It was like me and Tom Yamachika, this tax lawyer who's kind of on the other side of almost every issue. He's more conservative, but we agreed on REITs because he just doesn't think anybody should get an exemption. And we would go to these hearings, him, Roger Epstein, who worked with Faith Action on this, we'd be like testifying, and then there'd be like every lobbyist for like the real estate industry against us. And we would lose, like we would get
And they were dressed well. I would see some of those. They'd come up in their like suits and dresses. I was like, what is going on? This is like a joke.
Yeah, actually in DC, I used to always try to figure out which side of an issue people were on just by looking at their shoes. You know, or how well their suit fit, whether it was tailored. But yeah, so here in Hawaii, the first couple of years we worked on the REITs bill, we would just get killed. First hearing, we'd get killed because it was like a few geeks, basically, right? A couple tax lawyers, policy analysts. We would just get killed every time. And then Faith Action came on board, and it was incredible. I think part of it was like a lot of the folks in Faith Action didn't realize how hard it was going to be.
Yeah.
But so much work. I mean, there were so many hearings, but you guys kept coming, you kept working on it, and you got the law passed. I mean, it's unfortunate that the governor vetoed, but Faith Action did everything possible, you know, pressuring the governor to the last minute. And I think there's a chance that that bill might pass. They need money now, and Faith Action's done a lot of the groundwork. You know, we can say the bill passed.
Yep.
Do it again. So, you know, that's an example of how faith communities really can make a difference. Because that bill would not have gone anywhere without Faith Action.
Yeah. Yeah, that was wild. I think I would watch Jeffrey in some of his presentations to people, watching everyone get kind of excited and amped up about it. And he'd be like, I've spent years trying to tell people and no one cared. And now there's a whole room of people who think this is awful. And he is, you know how he is. He's just like super, super nice and funny. But yeah, that was good. That was a really powerful, it was such a bummer, like that the governor would veto that. But I think you're right. I mean, things are changing right now. And that things changing is I had another question I wanted to kind of follow up on before, but I got a little went in this area. When you were talking about the minimum wage of Hawaii being, you know, 10.10, and then you also talked about the immigrant community and what we're seeing now, you know, coming with the pandemic. And I love everyone on this call, and I want to say all the things that are going to make your heart feel good and not be afraid, but we're in a scary time, and I have to ask some questions that might make people feel the anxiety that's going on in the world. But well, my question is Hawaii, do you sense Hawaii is feeling this, like, is the breaking point is coming sooner or has already come for a higher percentage of people in our state than maybe in other states because of the low minimum wage, because of all of the industries that are shut down? Where are we sort of economically on that breaking point in your sort of, you know, studied opinion, taking into account all of the different communities you've been in touch with? Does that make sense? Am I making some sense there?
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
There's been so much evidence that, I mean, again, we put some of it on our Facebook. Every now and then I'll write a blog post on the Hawaii Appleseed, but, you know, evidence keeps coming in that Hawaii is, I would argue, the hardest hit economy in the country. Just a couple days ago, CNN and Moody's Analytics came out with a back to normal index. So that's the newest one, but it basically shows how far different states are from getting back to normal. And we are the worst state We are at 61% of the economy running, while the national average is above 70. And you know, it's been like that since the beginning of the pandemic. We had the, you know, sharpest increase. We went from one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation to the highest for a while. I think we're often competing with Nevada for obvious reasons. We already had an affordable housing crisis. So, you know, I don't know if some of you were involved in the HECO utility shutoff moratorium, but that was a recent thing that the Sierra Club was leading. They were about to shut off people's utilities on September 1st if they hadn't paid up. So that was just extended through December 31st. And, you know, I think that was due to like grassroots pressure. The Sierra Club went down on it, right? And thank goodness that they did that. But also our eviction moratorium, the governor just, I think he extended it another month. But that's part of why Hawaii Appleseed is so concerned about the Federal CARES Act funds and about getting it into the hands of people. Because at some point the eviction moratorium is going to end. Mm-hmm. And we already have a lot of homelessness. Like, you can see it coming, right? And it's like, you know, governor, state legislators, get your ducks in a row, get the money flowing to these families so that they don't get evicted. We know the $600 in federal unemployment insurance, $600 a week. That actually ended on July 25th because of the weird way the federal law was written. It ended kind of early for most states. So it's been a month. Those families have not had $600 a week. And so, you know, I just heard that Governor Ige is going to apply for the Trump $300 a week, which it's not really clear what that is, or it's probably not going to last very long, but it's something. But, you know, we were very disappointed that Governor Ige vetoed, line item vetoed, money that the state legislature had allocated, that starting August 1st, these families would get $100 a week. It's not a lot, but that's how much we could afford as a state. They were, you know, thinking of it going through till the end of the year. And for some reason, the governor vetoed that. He said that he wanted to wait to see what the federal government was going to do. But that meant these families suffered for 4 weeks and probably longer, because it's going to take time. If we do get the $300 a week through the Trump program, it's going to take a while to get that up and running. So it's just really unfortunate that, you know, we have hundreds of millions of dollars literally sitting in the governor's bank account. And it's just not getting out to people right now. And they only have 4 months left to spend it. The money expires on December 30th. Anything not spent has to go back to the feds. And Hawaii can't afford to let any of that money go. So, yeah.
So take us through the advocacy when we're out of session, where there's a lot of closed door sessions happening among people just making executive decisions about this money. Like, how do you break through what to me seems somewhat impenetrable, or at least inscrutable, to advocate in this way? Is it letters? Is it phone calls? What are you doing?
Yeah, so on Sunday, there was an op-ed about this, this money that I actually helped write, but I didn't sign it. But it's from the Working Families Coalition, and it was about the CARES Act funds. And it specifically spoke about this, about the need to move this money. So the Working Families Coalition is something that was started, originally it was just the Paid Family Leave Coalition, and it was a lot of women and children's focus groups. And they realized they wanted to start working on things like the minimum wage, because that's, you know, the majority of minimum wage workers are women. This would help families. So the name of that coalition changed to the Working Families Coalition. And it's broadened out to include, you know, kapuna groups and labor unions and all different types of folks who are concerned about the mostly the economic security of working families. So that was the op-ed in the Star Advertiser. We're probably going to start a petition along the same lines to try to get people to sign on, try to do what the Sierra Club did just now with the utility shutoff, just try to apply some pressure. You know, the legislature came back to session a couple times, you know, during the pandemic, and, you know, we had a rally in front of the Capitol. You know, we put out position papers after talking to dozens of other groups about what's needed in the community. I think some of you guys were at the rally at the Capitol. And then the state legislature just like pushed this bill through in the most like undemocratic way. They picked a bill that had kind of died during the last session, that was at the last step, and they revived it, completely rewrote it. They did that gut and replace that you hear about, and then they just passed it. There was no chance for public testimony. It was really frustrating because we were ready with, web templates. Like we were going to send it out to people and be like, send a note that you want them to spend the money this way. And we were completely cut off because of the way that they decided to pass this bill. And then the governor vetoed a bunch of it. So yeah, now we're doing things like op-eds, letters to the editor help, calling your legislators helps, saying you're a constituent always. If we have this petition, we'll send it out as far and wide. And we're actually working on getting stories of families as well. Families that are hurting, because the media, they always ask for a real family, a real person. So we're actually working on developing that so that if and when we pull the trigger, going to the media, we'll have stories of real people being hurt right now. And I think that helps as well. If they start getting some really bad media, I think things will change. So we just kind of try to pull every lever that we can.
Yeah, I have a question from Keith here, who's asking, and it's a great question. When you're talking about the evictions and the moratoriums, I mean, so much of rental now is credit and is like history. Do you know policy-wise whether there's any protections for people who maybe haven't been making payments and need to move or to change, or how that's working with being able to, I mean, that's a significant amount of unpaid rent that my understanding is will somehow be due or at least collectible. And how is that going to then impact people who are trying to find either another place to live or just trying to make regular rent payments on top of what has accrued? Has there been any way to, I mean, housing is just such a central issue in where we are living. So in his specific question, there are a lot of issues. I'm wondering if you can address some of those.
Yeah, so with the CARES Act funds, a lot of states and cities have been applying it to rental assistance and mortgage assistance. And City and County of Honolulu has had a hardship fund. Aloha United Way and some other nonprofits have been trying to administer it. Some of the other counties have started to run rental assistance funds as well. And the state is slowly trying to get one started. The legislature allocated $100 million for the state level rental assistance fund. That number came from some of my colleagues who worked with UHERO, the University of Hawaii's Economic Research Group, on what the need was. This much rent for this many people for this many months. Governor Ige line item vetoed it and turned it into 50 million. Part of the reason he did that is that Aloha United Way and other nonprofits have been having a lot of trouble getting the money out the door. And this has not been public yet. We are thinking about pulling the trigger with the media on this, but there are folks kind of in our coalition of service providers who want to keep trying, working on legislators rather than burning bridges. So I want to respect that, please don't run to the media with this information. But City and County of Honolulu's documentation requirements and rules for getting this money out has been really burdensome. And Aloha United Way they've got great data. They have all these applications that are just on hold, right? They can't get the required documentation, or, there's a small thing that's preventing them from getting the money out. So one of the things the governor said was, Honolulu is not getting their money out, so maybe there isn't that much need. We know that's not, and that's another thing I'm working on is looking at other states, in other places, they're running through their money in like 3 days. Like they have to shut down the program because, they're just sending the money out to people. But different states have different rules. So yeah, it can be applied to 6 months of rent you know, if we want to be generous. It can apply to security deposits if you want to move into a new place. It's all about the rules that are put in. And that's another level of advocacy. It's not the laws, but it's these rules and regulations. And a lot of this right now is meetings. You know, Aloha United Way and other nonprofits are trying to meet with the key people at the city and the state level to try to encourage them to loosen up the rules. And you know, I've been supporting them with that, and my colleagues, looking at what other states are doing, trying to provide good examples of other states and how they're doing it. So there is money. That's the one thing. The CARES Act gave Hawaii $1.25 billion to spend on, you know, COVID-related issues. And, you know, around the country, people have said, you know, people are they're not able to pay their rent because they lost their job because of COVID. And so hopefully we can move this. But you might see this in the media as well, because I think we're pretty close to pulling the trigger on going to the media with this. But we're not there yet, so don't call HNN tonight, because we need to move at once together. Yeah.
Do you want do you want us to hold off on, we normally post this tonight, the interview. Do you want me to hold it for a few days until you tell me when I can post it, or are you not too worried? I
mean, I don't think you get a huge amount of.
Kevin Lander's got about 150 views, so that's our highest. So, but yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's not like a secret, but it's also not something that we've gone to the media with on purpose, because folks just don't want to burn bridges yet. So, but I'm not going to the media. I'm telling a group of people from a church.
That's true. That's true. And Yahoo and Facebook with like nothing else than to have the world believe they're not a media company, but that's a whole nother discussion about
it's okay.
the FCC. But so I see there's another question. In general, I had mentioned it's if possible to send me the questions privately, but do you think we will give our people the federal money offered to Hawaii, or will we give it back? My hunch is Hawaii is going to find a way to spend it. It may not be in the way we want it to be spent, but my hunch is it's not going back. Would you say the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I can get super wonky on this because we've been working on this for months, but through the Working Families Coalition, we put out position papers, a few of them. And for a while, the state legislators and the governor seem to be leaning towards dumping a lot of the money, like most of it, hundreds of millions of dollars, into our unemployment insurance trust fund. And that's, yeah, so that's kind of hard to explain, but let's see. So there's a trust fund for UI that all the states are spending down. They're almost all depleting their UI trust funds right now. And this is paid by, you know, our payroll taxes and our employers' payroll taxes. Some of it goes to UI. During the last recession, Hawaii and 36 states got a zero interest line of credit from the federal government just for their UI trust funds. And Hawaii was one of the first states to apply for it here in Hawaii. So we have already started tapping that zero interest line of credit from the feds. So UI is going to keep going. People are still going to get unemployment insurance, even though our trust fund has been depleted. And the way it gets built back up is, you know, in 2021, 2022, employers are going to have to pay a slightly higher percent in their UI taxes, which is, you know, it's not ideal, but it's also kind of in the future. So I actually checked with UI experts in DC to ask what they thought, and they don't think that spending this CARES Act money on UI trust funds is a great way to spend money, because it's not getting money to people now who need it. It's basically helping employers 2 or 3 years from now, right? They'll save some money later on. You know, it's an allowable use. There are some states, definitely a bunch of Republican states, that are putting a big chunk of their money into the UI trust fund. So I think Hawaii will end up putting some of our money into the UI trust fund. you know, I can't tell, you know, I'm not the legislator, I'm not the governor. So if they think that's how it's gonna have to be, it's gonna have to be. But as the Working Families Coalition and Hawaii Appleseed, we're trying to say, let's keep that to a minimum. Let's focus on getting money to people right now rather than trying to save money, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the future. So I know that's super wonky, you know, but I would prefer that the money go to that than to get returned to the feds. And the way it is right now, we have a lot of money that's not allocated, and you know, they need to figure out how they're going to spend it, or else, you know, we have 4 months to spend $635 million just for the state of Hawaii alone. And the counties have their own money, so the other half, basically.
Thanks. We are, I know I've gotten a few other comments, but I think rather than go on with that, I think one of the things we like to ask is, of anyone who comes on, is there something right now that for Appleseed is priority that, say, a group of people on a Pau Hana on a Tuesday with some time on their hands sometimes, what is it that you'd hope or would want a group like that to be doing or to be aware of? Or, you know, what would you hope we would take from our time with you?
Well, I think, you know, a general message, which I think a lot of you already know, is that being a constituent is a powerful thing. You know, legislators, whether they're on Capitol Hill or here in Hawaii, like, they don't really want to hear from people like me. They want to hear from constituents. So you have a lot more power than you realize. So, you know, get to know your legislators, bug them, harass them, let them know what you think. You know, we don't have an active campaign right now, but as I said, we're about to launch some, I think. And I'll make sure I pass it on to Pastor TJ. But, you know, if you want to write a letter to the editor, they read that stuff on whatever issue you think is important. You know, personally right now, I'm obsessed with the CARES Act funding and making sure that people get it. But there's a lot of other issues, you know, that folks are thinking about. As Hawaii Appleseed, and I think your congregation, a real focus on making sure that this pandemic doesn't make our inequalities worse. We know it already is. We have to find ways to minimize that as much as possible. So, you know, I don't have a specific campaign right now, but you'll probably hear from me soon.
Well, I think we'd all like that as much as we've liked hearing from you for the last hour. And you're so kind to take the time to speak with us and to answer all my many questions. But it was really a joy to get to chat more like this. I know a lot of times we're just doing work together. We're just texting and like getting people to the airport and stuff like that. So it was good to sit down and really hear more about what you're doing. So thank you so much for your time and for all that you're doing. And we really look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Well, I'm going to just end this recording for everyone.